They're listening. Subscribe, like, comment, and share with your friends and family.
I'm Dirk Rhodes. I was 29 when I decided I needed to disappear for a while, not from any one person or problem, just from the constant low-level noise of everything. Not running away, not having some kind of spiritual awakening, just hitting the pause button on a life that felt like it was playing on fast forward with the volume stuck on high. So I figured, why not the Smokies? Not the tourist side with the pancake restaurants and traffic jams, just a solid 5-day backcountry loop starting near Cades Cove and winding up through some of the older, quieter sections where the trails get narrow and the tree cover gets thick enough to block out the sky. It sounded remote enough that I wouldn't be dodging selfie sticks every 10 yards, but still mapped well enough that I could bail if my knees gave out or I ran into weather. I kept it simple. Told my supervisor I was taking a week of PTO. Sent my brother a text that said something like, hiking the Smokies, won't have signal. That was it. No Facebook check-ins, no Garmin tracker link posted to the family group chat, no dramatic, finding myself, speeches. The last thing I needed was my phone buzzing every 6 hours with someone asking if I'd achieved enlightenment yet. I wasn't out there looking for answers. I wasn't trying to process anything or work through some deep emotional stuff. I was just exhausted. Like that bone-deep tired you get from too many open browser tabs in your brain, tired. I wanted to hear wind in the trees instead of traffic. I wanted to think about where to put my next foot instead of where my career was going. Or better yet, I wanted to not think at all. The first 2 days delivered exactly that. Long, empty stretches of trail where the only sounds were my boots on dirt and the occasional rustle of something small moving through the underbrush. You notice different things when you're that deep in the woods, like how the light changes color as it filters through different types of leaves, or how certain rocks feel cool even in direct sunlight, or the way moss grows in patterns that almost look intentional. Everything gets sharper when there's nothing competing for your attention. I got that specific kind of tired you only earn by walking uphill for hours, where your legs burn but it feels productive, like you've used your body for something real instead of just carrying it between chairs. I ate those questionable dehydrated meals that taste like cardboard but somehow feel satisfying when you're hungry enough. Slept in my hammock. Filtered creek water that tasted like minerals and cold. Saw a doe and her fawn one morning, close enough that I could see their breath. Even caught a glimpse of what might have been a black bear moving through a ridge above me, far enough away that we both pretended not to notice each other. I was careful. Maybe too careful, honestly. Hung my food bag every night using the PCT method I practiced in my backyard. Built fires in existing rings only, kept them small, drowned them completely. Studied my maps every evening, marked waypoints, noted creek crossings and elevation changes. I had contingency routes planned for bad weather, twisted ankles, or just deciding I'd had enough. That kind of over-preparation is comforting when you're alone out there. Made me feel like I had everything under control. Night 3 is when that feeling died. I'd set up camp in a hollow just off the Boat Mountain Trail, maybe 8 miles past the point where most day hikers turn around. There was a clearing with enough flat ground for my hammock setup, a good water source about 50 yards downhill, and decent tree coverage in case rain rolled in. I remember thinking it was perfect, exactly the kind of spot where nothing bad could happen. I'm Jeffrey Patterson, and I've been hiking the Smokies for about 8 years now. Not the kind of guy who goes off-trail looking for adventure or pushing limits, just solid day hikes on well-marked routes, usually solo because my schedule's unpredictable and most of my friends aren't into the whole walk uphill for 6 hours thing. I'm a paramedic in Knoxville, work rotating shifts, and hiking's how I decompress between the chaos of emergency calls and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from holding people together while they're falling apart. The day I got lost was supposed to be routine. I'd taken the Alum Cave trail up toward Mount Laconde, planning to turn around at the cave itself rather than pushing all the way to the summit. It was early October, perfect weather, mid-60s, clear skies, that specific quality of light you only get when the leaves are just starting to turn. I'd done this trail maybe a dozen times before. Could practically walk it in my sleep. But fog rolled in around 1,400 hours, and it didn't roll so much as materialize. 1 minute I had clear visibility across the ridge, the next I was surrounded by gray mist so thick I couldn't see my boots without looking straight down. I've been in mountain fog before. It's not uncommon in the Smokies, especially in fall when temperature differentials create these sudden atmospheric changes. But this was different. Heavier. Quieter. Like someone had wrapped the entire mountain in insulation that muffled sound along with visibility. I stopped immediately, pulled out my phone to check the GPS. The trail app showed my position clearly enough, about 2 miles from Alum Cave, well within familiar territory. But when I looked up from the screen to match my surroundings to the topographic details, nothing lined up. The terrain rolled in gentle slopes when it should have been relatively steep. Trees that should have been predominantly hemlock looked more like young oak. And I couldn't hear the creak that should have been audible from this elevation. I'm not the panicking type. 8 years of emergency medicine teaches you to assess situations methodically rather than react emotionally. So I checked my compass, working fine, and started walking back the way I'd come, following the trail markers I knew should be spaced every 50 yards or so along this section. The fog would lift eventually. It always did. And even if it didn't, I had enough experience to navigate by dead reckoning until I hit a landmark I recognized. That's when I saw him. He was standing maybe 40 feet ahead, just barely visible through the fog. Tall, unusually tall, probably 6'8" or more, with a gaunt frame that made him look stretched somehow, like his proportions didn't quite match human anatomy. He wore dark clothing that could have been hiking gear or just regular clothes, difficult to distinguish in the diffused light. And he was completely motionless, facing roughly my direction but not acknowledging my presence in any obvious way. "Hey!" I called out, relieved to find another hiker in this disorienting landscape. "You familiar with this trail? I'm a bit turned around in this fog." No response. He remained motionless for another few seconds, long enough that I started wondering if he'd even heard me, then turned and started walking perpendicular to the direction I'd been heading. Not hurrying, not looking back to see if I was following, just moving with this steady, unnaturally smooth gait that reminded me of patients I'd treated who had certain neurological conditions affecting their movement patterns. I followed him because what else was I going to do? He was either heading toward the trail or toward some recognizable landmark, and either outcome was better than continuing to wander through fog-obscured terrain that didn't match my mental map. We walked for maybe 15 minutes, him maintaining that steady pace about 30 yards ahead of me, never varying his speed or checking if I was keeping up. I tried calling out to him several more times. Asked his name. Asked if he was a local who knew these trails. Asked how far to the main trail. He never acknowledged my questions. Just kept walking in that unsettling glide stride that looked more like hovering than actual footsteps. His shoulders never moved with the normal rhythm of walking. His arms hung too still at his sides. And his head maintained the same forward-facing position without the small adjustments people unconsciously make when navigating uneven terrain. The fog started thinning as we walked, and I could make out more details of my guide's appearance. His build wasn't just tall but skeletal, shoulders too narrow for his height, limbs too long, head slightly too large for his frame. His hair was dark and hung lank against his skull. And his clothes, now that I could see them better, looked wrong somehow. Not old or damaged exactly, just dated. Like he was wearing hiking gear from maybe the 90s, before modern technical fabrics became standard. Then we crested a small rise, and I saw the trail markers maybe 60 yards ahead. Those familiar white blazes on trees that marked the Alum Cave Trail exactly where it should be according to my GPS relief flooded through me. I'd been lost for less than half an hour, my silent guide had gotten me back to familiar territory, and I could continue my hike without the embarrassment of needing to call for search and rescue. "Man, thank you so much," I said, turning to address him properly. "I really appreciate you taking the time to." He was gone. Not walking away, not disappearing behind a tree or into the fog that had mostly dissipated. Just absent, like he'd never been there at all. I spun in a complete circle, checking every direction, but the landscape showed no sign of another person. No sound of footsteps moving away through the underbrush. No disturbed leaves marking his passage. No indication whatsoever that anyone had been walking 30 yards ahead of me for the past 15 minutes. The hair on my neck stood up with that primal recognition that something was fundamentally wrong. People don't vanish without sound. They don't move with that gliding, jointless gait. And they definitely don't leave zero trace in forest floor covered with leaves and fallen branches that should clearly show their footprints. I looked down at the ground where we'd been walking. My boot prints were clearly visible in the soft earth and leaf litter, creating an obvious trail back the way I'd come. But there were no other prints. Just mine. Like I'd been following no one, walking alone through the fog while my brain manufactured the image of a helpful guide to cope with the disorientation. Except I'd seen him. Had watched him move. Had called out to him multiple times and received that unsettling non-response that confirmed he was real, just not interested in conversation. I got back to the trailhead parking area faster than I'd planned, practically jogging the last mile despite my heart rate being elevated for reasons that had nothing to do with physical exertion. My car sat exactly where I'd left it, familiar and mundane and reassuringly normal. I loaded my pack with hands that shook slightly, telling myself I'd experienced some kind of fog-induced disorientation, that my guide had simply moved out of sight before I could thank him properly. But that night in my apartment, I couldn't stop thinking about his proportions. About the way he'd moved. About his complete silence despite walking through terrain that should have generated constant small sounds, boots on leaves, breathing, equipment rattling. About how he'd known exactly where to lead me despite never checking a map or GPS. I opened my laptop and started searching, because methodical investigation is how I process things I don't understand. I searched for tall hiker Smokies, missing persons Alum Cave Trail, unexplained encounters Great Smoky Mountains. Most results were tourist blog posts and wildlife safety information, nothing relevant to my experience. Then I refined my search to Missing Hikers Great Smoky Mountains National Park and started scrolling through incident reports. Most were resolved cases, people who'd gotten temporarily lost and were found within hours, or tragic accidents where bodies were eventually recovered. But one report from 3 years ago made me stop scrolling. Marcus Webb. Age 34. Last seen on the Alum Cave Trail near Inspiration Point. Physical description, 6'8", approximately 165 pounds, described by family as unusually tall and thin. Wearing dark North Face jacket and hiking pants. Experienced hiker with extensive backcountry experience. Vanished during clear weather with no fog or adverse conditions reported. Extensive search operations involving multiple agencies found no trace. Case remains open but inactive. The incident report included a photograph, driver's license image showing a gaunt man with the exact skeletal proportions I'd seen. Same narrow shoulders. Same oversized head on a too thin neck. Same dark clothing preferences mentioned in the family's description. Same unsettling proportions that made him look stretched. I stared at the photograph for a long time, my paramedic training trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Coincidence? Misidentification? Fog-induced hallucination that made me project Marcus Webb's appearance onto some random helpful hiker who happened to be unusually tall. But Marcus Webb had been missing for 3 years. And the man who'd guided me back to the trail hadn't left footprints in soft ground that clearly showed mine. Hadn't made a single sound moving through forest that transmitted every small noise once the fog lifted. Hadn't acknowledged my presence beyond the mechanical action of leading me to safety. I thought about calling the Park Service, filing some kind of report about my encounter. But what would I say? That a missing hiker had silently guided me back to the main trail before vanishing without trace. That sounded less like legitimate witness testimony and more like the kind of statement that gets you flagged for psychological evaluation. Instead, I took a screenshot of Marcus Webb's missing person report and saved it to a folder I labeled Alum Cave, October. Told myself I'd follow up later, maybe reach out to the family if I could find contact information, ask if Marcus had exhibited any unusual behaviors before his disappearance. But I never did. Because part of me, the part that had watched him move with that jointless glide, had seen him vanish without sound, had walked in his footsteps that didn't exist, knew that whatever I'd followed through that fog wasn't Marcus Webb anymore. Or maybe it was Marcus Webb, still walking the Alum Cave Trail 3 years after he vanished. Still helping lost hikers find their way back to marked paths. Still moving with that unsettling mechanical precision that suggested he'd stopped being entirely human sometime between his last known position at Inspiration Point and whatever claimed him in these mountains. I haven't been back to the Alum Cave Trail since that afternoon. Haven't been able to make myself drive to that trailhead despite having dozens of other hikes I could do in the Smokies. Because I keep thinking about Marcus Webb walking those trails for 3 years, guiding lost hikers back to safety with that silent, inhuman helpfulness. And I keep wondering what happens to the hikers he guides who don't make it back to the main trail. The ones who follow him in a different direction, deeper into fog-obscured wilderness where their GPS stops working and the terrain doesn't match any map. The ones who vanish during clear weather, just like Marcus Webb did 3 years ago. My GPS track log from that day shows my route clearly until the moment the fog appeared. Then it goes erratic, jumping between coordinates that should be miles apart, recording elevation changes that don't match the gentle slopes I remember walking. And for exactly 15 minutes, the duration I followed my silent guide, the GPS records no data at all. Just a blank gap in the log file, like I'd stopped existing in normal space during that walk. I showed the corrupted file to a tech-savvy friend who works in GPS systems. He said he'd never seen that failure pattern before. Said it looked less like equipment malfunction and more like someone had deliberately scrubbed those 15 minutes of positioning data from my device. But no one could have accessed my phone. It never left my possession, and the file corruption appeared immediately when I checked it that same evening. Which means either my equipment failed in a way that perfectly mimics data manipulation, or something about following Marcus Webb through that fog caused my GPS to stop recording my position in normal 3-dimensional space. Last week, another hiker went missing on the Alum Cave Trail. 26-year-old woman from Nashville, experienced backpacker, vanished during clear conditions with her GPS still transmitting until the signal just stopped. Search teams found her pack at Inspiration Point, the exact location where Marcus Webb was last seen 3 years ago. But they didn't find her. I wonder if she's walking those trails now too, guiding lost hikers with that same silent mechanical helpfulness. Wonder if there's a whole network of them up there, people who followed something into the fog and never quite made it all the way back. Wonder if next time the fog rolls in and I see that tall, gaunt figure standing in the mist, I'll have the sense to turn around and walk the other direction. Or if I'll follow him again, deeper this time, into wherever Marcus Webb has been for the past 3 years. Into wherever they all go, when the Smokies decide to keep them. I'm Andy Willis, and I teach geology at a community college in Asheville. I've been hiking the Smokies since I moved to North Carolina 6 years ago, usually solo because my schedule's erratic and most of my colleagues aren't into the whole, walk uphill for 8 hours carrying everything you need on your back, lifestyle. It's how I reset between semesters, between the fluorescent-lit classrooms and the endless grading and the departmental meetings that could have been emails. The weekend I found the fire was supposed to be a quick overnighter, hike in Friday afternoon, camp somewhere along the Boat Mountain Trail, hike out Saturday morning. Nothing ambitious. I'd done this route maybe a dozen times, knew the terrain well enough that I didn't need to study maps anymore. Just throw my gear in the truck, drive to Cades Cove, and disappear into the woods for 36 hours of not thinking about enrollment numbers or curriculum reviews. I left the trailhead around 1,600 hours, planning to make camp before sunset. The trail climbed steadily through mixed hardwood forest, and I settled into that comfortable rhythm where your legs just know what to do and your brain can wander. Perfect October weather, mid-60s, clear skies, that specific quality of light you only get when the leaves are starting to turn but haven't fully committed yet. Around 1830 hours, I spotted what looked like a clearing about 50 yards off the main trail. Not uncommon in this area, the Smokies have these natural openings where the canopy breaks and undergrowth can't establish because of soil composition or drainage issues. I'd camped in similar spots before, preferred them over designated sites because you didn't have to worry about other hikers showing up and making awkward small talk about gear choices. The clearing was maybe 40 feet across, ringed by mature oaks and hickories that formed a natural windbreak. Flat ground, good drainage, no obvious widowmakers overhead. Perfect camping spot, though oddly absent from my topographic map despite being large enough to warrant notation. But I'd learned over the years that sometimes the best sites aren't officially documented, just hidden gems that backcountry travelers discover through luck or careful observation. That's when I saw the campfire. It sat in the exact center of the clearing, built with the kind of precision you only see from someone who really knows what they're doing. Stones arranged in a proper fire ring, maybe 18 inches across. Wood stacked in a classic log cabin structure that would allow optimal airflow and even burning. Flames dancing with steady brightness that suggested well-seasoned fuel and perfect oxygen flow. Someone had clearly made camp here recently, though I'd passed no other hikers on the trail and the nearest designated campsite was 3 miles south. I approached slowly, scanning the clearing for signs of whoever had built it. A tent, camping gear, a pack leaning against a tree, anything that would indicate someone else was using this spot. But the clearing was completely empty except for the fire itself. No equipment. No footprints in the soft ground around the fire ring. No disturbed vegetation suggesting anyone had moved through the area recently. The fire burned steadily, flames reaching maybe 20 inches high, wood crackling with that familiar sound that should have been accompanied by radiating warmth. I stood about 15 feet away, expecting to feel heat on my face the way you always do when approaching an active campfire. But the air temperature remained cool, unchanged from the ambient evening chill that had settled over the forest as the sun dropped below the ridge line. I moved closer, thinking maybe the fire was smaller than it appeared and distance was preventing me from feeling the warmth. At 10 feet, I should have been feeling significant heat. At 5 feet, the radiant energy should have been intense enough to make me instinctively step back. But the temperature didn't change at all. The fire burned bright and steady, consuming wood with visible flame, producing that characteristic crackling sound, but emitting absolutely no thermal radiation. This violated every principle I'd spent years teaching students. Fire is an exothermic chemical reaction. It releases energy primarily as heat and light. The combustion of wood involves breaking molecular bonds in cellulose and lignin, oxidizing carbon and hydrogen, producing carbon dioxide, water vapor, and massive amounts of thermal energy. You cannot have flame without heat transfer. It's not a matter of opinion or interpretation, it's basic thermochemistry that governs how combustion works in our physical universe. But this fire was producing light and sound without any heat whatsoever. I pulled off my glove and extended my hand toward the flames, moving slowly because some part of my brain still expected thermal feedback that would stop me before I got close enough to burn myself. My fingers passed within inches of the fire. Nothing. No warmth. No heat radiation. Just cool evening air that should have been physically impossible at this proximity to active combustion. I held my hand directly above the fire, palm down, maybe 6 inches from flames that should have immediately blistered my skin. The firelight cast my shadow across the clearing, and I could see the flames dancing between my spread fingers, yellow and orange tongues licking upward in patterns that matched normal fire behavior. But I felt nothing except the gentle evening breeze moving through the forest, carrying the scent of decaying leaves and damp earth, but no smoke, no heat, nothing that suggested combustion was actually occurring. I crouched beside the fire ring, examining the stones that formed its perimeter. They should have been scorching hot. Stones retain thermal energy and would be dangerous to touch anywhere near an active fire. Basic heat capacity principles. But when I pressed my palm flat against them, they were cool. Room temperature. Like the fire had been burning for hours without transferring any thermal energy to its immediate surroundings, which violated every law of thermodynamics I understood. The wood was definitely being consumed. I watched the flames eating through the log cabin structure, turning solid timber into ash and ember. Pieces broke off and fell into the fire's center, glowing briefly before darkening. But the consumption appeared to be happening at a visual level only. The wood was getting smaller, changing color and texture in ways that matched normal fire progression, but without the actual exothermic reaction that should have been releasing joules of heat energy into the surrounding air. I pulled out my phone and checked the temperature reading from my weather app. 48 degrees Fahrenheit. Then I held the phone 6 inches above the flames, right where my hand had been moments before, and watched the temperature display. It didn't change. Stayed at 48 degrees despite being positioned directly in the path of what should have been superheated air rising from active combustion through natural convection. My academic training demanded I document this phenomenon properly. I needed photographs, video footage, multiple temperature readings from various positions around the fire. This was the kind of anomaly that could revolutionize our understanding of combustion chemistry, if I could prove it was real and not some elaborate hallucination brought on by exhaustion and the strange quality of twilight in these mountains. But my survival instincts, refined through years of solo backcountry travel, screamed that I'd stumbled onto something dangerous precisely because it operated outside normal physical parameters. Something that could create the appearance of fire without the reality of combustion was something that existed in a framework I didn't understand and couldn't predict. I stood up and backed away from the fire, putting distance between myself and the impossible phenomenon. My pack lay where I'd dropped it near the clearing's edge, and I needed my camera from the side pocket. Needed documentation before I hiked out and reported this to park authorities, or maybe contacted colleagues in the chemistry department who might have some explanation for fire that produced light but no heat. I turned away from the fire to grab my camera, and behind me something exploded. The sound was massive, like a propane tank detonating in the clearing center. I spun back toward the fire just in time to see burning logs flying outward in all directions, thrown with violent force by something completely invisible. The carefully constructed fire ring shattered, stones tumbling across the clearing like they'd been kicked by boots I couldn't see. Flaming wood arced through the air, some pieces traveling 20 feet before landing in oak leaves and pine needles that should have immediately ignited. But the leaves didn't catch fire. The burning logs just lay there among them, flames still visible but producing no heat, no ignition of surrounding fuel. Like the fire existed in some parallel state where it could be seen but couldn't interact thermally with the physical world. And then, all at once, every flame extinguished simultaneously. Not gradually dying like normal fire, not the slow fade as oxygen depletes or fuel is consumed, just switching off like someone had flipped a circuit breaker that controlled their existence. The clearing went dark except for my headlamp, and the sudden absence of light felt more oppressive than simple darkness should feel. I stood frozen, headlamp beam sweeping across the clearing in automatic search patterns. The logs that had been thrown outward lay scattered exactly where they'd landed, but they weren't burning anymore. Weren't even smoldering. I approached the nearest one cautiously and nudged it with my boot. Cool. Just slightly charred wood showing surface damage, but none of the deep combustion that should have resulted from being part of an active fire for however long it had been burning. The fire ring stones lay scattered too, distributed in a radial pattern that suggested they'd been thrown rather than simply knocked over. I walked to the clearing center where the fire had been and crouched down, pressing my palm against the ground. Cool. Not even residual warmth in the soil that should have been superheated by prolonged contact with flame, that should have retained thermal energy for hours after the fire extinguished. Something had built that fire, or created the appearance of fire. Something had maintained it with perfect structural integrity and steady flame that violated thermodynamic principles I'd built my entire career on understanding. And something had waited until the exact moment I turned my back to demonstrate how much force it could apply, scattering burning wood and stones with enough violence to make a sound like an explosion. Whatever that something was, it remained completely invisible. Completely silent except for the destruction it caused. And it was still here in this clearing with me, watching my reaction to its display of power. I didn't bother setting up my tent. Didn't even consider spending the night in that clearing. Just grabbed my pack and started moving back toward the main trail, not quite running but walking faster than was safe in the growing darkness. My headlamp beam bounced erratically as I navigated through underbrush, and I kept glancing over my shoulder expecting to see, what? I didn't know. Whatever could throw burning logs 20 feet while remaining invisible. Whatever could create fire without heat. Whatever had decided I'd seen enough and needed to understand it could hurt me if it chose to. I made it back to the trailhead parking area around 2,100 hours, legs shaking from the combination of rapid hiking over rough terrain and adrenaline that hadn't dissipated despite 2 hours of putting distance between myself and that clearing. My truck sat exactly where I'd left it, familiar and mundane and reassuringly normal. I didn't go back to Asheville that night. Drove to a motel in Townsend instead, paid cash for a room, and sat on the bed staring at my phone trying to decide whether to call the park service. But what would I report? That I'd found fire that violated the laws of thermodynamics. That invisible force had thrown burning logs when I turned my back. That sounded less like legitimate Park Service concern and more like symptoms requiring psychiatric evaluation from someone who'd been alone in the woods too long. 3 days later, I received a follow-up email from the National Park Service, standard survey about my backcountry experience. At the bottom was an optional comment field for reporting unusual observations. I stared at it for an hour before typing, found unmapped clearing approximately 2.3 miles north of Boat Mountain trailhead with evidence of recent fire activity. Fire exhibited unusual characteristics that may warrant investigation. I hit send before I could second-guess the decision, then immediately regretted it. They'd think I was crazy. They'd file my report alongside dozens of other vague tourist complaints about strange sounds or unusual wildlife. But 2 weeks later, I got a response from a ranger named Shirley Smith. She thanked me for my report and said they'd investigated the coordinates. They found the clearing. Found evidence of a fire ring. But no concerning activity or safety hazards requiring further action. Her email included one additional sentence. Please note that some thermal features in the Smokies can create unusual visual effects that may be mistaken for campfires, particularly in low-light conditions. She was giving me an explanation. A way to dismiss what I'd experienced as misidentified natural phenomenon. And she was doing it in a way that suggested she knew exactly what I'd actually encountered, but the official position was to attribute it to causes tourists could understand. I haven't been back to that section of the Boat Mountain Trail. Haven't been able to make myself hike past that clearing despite having a dozen other routes I could explore in the Smokies. Because I'm a geologist. I understand combustion at a molecular level. And I know with absolute certainty that I held my hand 6 inches above flames hot enough to produce that much light, and felt nothing except cool evening air that should have been impossible. Which means something in that clearing can create fire without heat. Can scatter burning logs with explosive force while remaining invisible. And the Park Service knows about it. I'm Stephen O'Brien, and I've been married to Rachel for 12 years. We have this thing where she'll call my name a specific way when she needs me, not panicked, not casual, just this particular tone that means, I need you to come here right now, but it's not an emergency. It's hard to describe unless you've been with someone long enough that you recognize the exact pitch and cadence of how they say your name in different contexts. After 12 years, I could identify Rachel's voice in a crowded stadium. That's why what happened on the Alum Cave Trail messed me up so badly. I was hiking with Molly, our 4-year-old border collie mix who's been my trail companion since she was a pup. Rachel had stayed home that Saturday, migraine coming on, needed quiet and darkness, so it was just me and Molly doing our usual loop. We'd been hiking together long enough that we had our rhythm down. She'd range ahead maybe 20 yards, check back to make sure I was still following, then continue exploring while I maintained steady pace behind her. It was mid-morning, maybe 1030 hours, and we were about 3 miles in when the trail narrowed along a section where the mountain drops off sharply to the right. Nothing dangerous if you stay on the path, but steep enough that you wouldn't want to slip, probably a 100-foot drop down to where the creek cuts through the ravine below. The cliff face rose maybe 60 feet on the left side, limestone and shale layered in those distinctive horizontal striations that geologists love and everyone else ignores. Molly was ranging ahead like normal when she suddenly stopped, went rigid, and her ears pinned back flat against her skull. I'd seen her react to wildlife before, deer, raccoons, even a black bear once, but this was different. She wasn't fixated on something ahead of us. She was staring at the ground directly in front of her paws, hackles raised, making this low continuous growl that I'd never heard from her before. "Molly, what is it?" I called out, closing the distance between us. She didn't acknowledge me, just kept staring at that specific patch of trail like something invisible was standing there. Then she started barking, not her usual alert bark when she sees wildlife, but this frantic, almost terrified sound that made my stomach drop. That's when I heard Rachel's voice. "Stephen." It came from above, from somewhere on the cliff face to my left. That exact tone she uses when she needs me. Not panicked, not casual, just that specific pitch that means, "Come here right now." I looked up and saw nothing but rock face and sparse vegetation clinging to cracks in the limestone. "Stephen, I need you up here." Still Rachel's voice. Still that exact cadence. And here's the thing that really got me. She used the little uptick at the end of "here" that she always does when she's trying not to sound demanding. That unconscious vocal pattern that you can't fake unless you've studied someone's speech for years. "Rachel?" I called back, confused because that was impossible. Rachel was home 40 miles away with a migraine, and even if she decided to surprise me by driving out and hiking in, she couldn't have gotten ahead of me on the trail, couldn't have climbed that cliff face, couldn't be up there calling my name. "I found something you need to see. Come up." Perfect intonation. Perfect rhythm. The way she'd say it if she discovered some geological formation she knew I'd find interesting, or spotted a hawk's nest, or any of the dozen reasons she might call me over during a hike. My brain was processing the impossibility while my body was already looking for handholds on the cliff face, because 12 years of marriage creates automatic responses to your spouse's voice that bypass rational thought. Molly's barking intensified. She was still staring at that specific spot on the trail, still rigid, but now she was alternating between barking and this high-pitched whine that sounded almost like distress. I'd never heard her make sounds like that. Never seen her this agitated about something I couldn't see. "Stephen, climb up." "I can't come down." Still perfect. Still Rachel. And my hands were on the rock face now, testing holds, finding that first foothold where I could start pulling myself up. The limestone was rough enough for decent grip, and there were obvious routes where water erosion had created natural climbing paths. Not technical climbing, just scrambling, the kind of thing I'd done dozens of times on other hikes when I wanted to get a better view or check out something interesting off the main trail. Molly stopped barking and started this deep, continuous growl that vibrated through her entire body. Then she did something she'd never done in 4 years of hiking together. She grabbed the hem of my jacket in her teeth and pulled backward, trying to drag me away from the cliff face. "Molly, stop it," I said, shaking her off. My hand was reaching for the next hold, my brain still trying to reconcile how Rachel could be up there but my body responding to that voice with automatic trust. "Stephen, please. I need you right now." The slight emphasis on "need." The way her voice got quieter on "right now," like she was trying not to sound desperate but couldn't quite hide it. Every pattern correct. Every nuance perfect. My wife's voice calling to me from an impossible location, and I was climbing toward it because 12 years of conditioning made that voice more real than the logical impossibility of the situation. Molly released my jacket and planted herself directly under where I was climbing. Not moving, not backing away, just positioning her body so that if I fell I'd land on her. And she was still making that low growl, still staring at something on the ground that I couldn't see. I was maybe 15 feet up the cliff face when I made the mistake of actually thinking instead of reacting. If Rachel was up there, how had she gotten there? The trail didn't connect to the top of this cliff face. The only access would be from the other side of the ridge, which would require hiking in from a completely different trailhead miles away. And why would she have done that with a migraine? Why would she have driven out here, parked at a different trailhead, hiked in from the opposite direction, climbed to this specific location, and called my name at the exact moment I was passing below? "Stephen, why did you stop? Keep climbing." Same voice. Same cadence. But now I was listening differently, and I noticed something I'd missed before. There was no echo. In this narrow section of trail with cliff faces on both sides and the ravine creating natural acoustics, Rachel's voice should have produced some kind of echo or reverberation. But it didn't. It sounded flat, direct, like it was being projected from a speaker rather than originating from a human throat in an outdoor environment. And she hadn't said anything specific. Hadn't explained what she'd found, why she needed me, how she'd gotten up there. Just those generic phrases designed to create urgency without providing information. Like someone was using her voice without understanding the content that should accompany it. I looked down at Molly. She was still staring at that spot on the trail, still growling, still positioned directly beneath me. And I realized she wasn't staring at the ground randomly, she was staring at the exact patch of trail I'd need to walk across to get directly under the cliff face where the voice was coming from. "Come on, Stephen. I'm getting tired of waiting." Wrong. That was wrong. Rachel doesn't get impatient like that. She doesn't say, "I'm getting tired of waiting," with that edge of irritation. She'd say, "Whenever you're ready," or "No rush," or make some self-deprecating joke about her impatience. The phrasing was off. The tone was shifting away from Rachel's actual speech patterns towards something generic, something that knew her voice but didn't know her personality. I climbed down. Carefully, testing each hold, trying not to think about how my hands were shaking now that I understood what I'd almost done. When I reached the ground, Molly immediately moved to my side, pressing against my leg, still staring at that spot on the trail and growling continuously. "Stephen, where are you going? Come back." The voice was changing. Stretching. Like an audio file being digitally manipulated, the pitch staying the same but the timing becoming unnatural. Words arriving too fast or too slow, with pauses in wrong places. Rachel's voice losing cohesion, becoming something that sounded like her but operated on principles that weren't human. I grabbed Molly's collar and backed away from that section of trail, keeping my eyes on the ground she'd been staring at. I couldn't see anything there. No disturbance in the dirt, no footprints, no visual indication of what she'd detected. But she was still fixated on it, still growling, and I trusted her perception more than I trusted my own eyes at that moment. "Stephen." The voice from above was distorting now, Rachel's name for me stretched into too many syllables, the pitch wobbling like failing electronics. "Stephen. Stephen. Stephen." I turned and ran, Molly keeping pace beside me, both of us putting distance between ourselves and that section of trail as fast as the terrain would allow. Behind us, the voice kept calling my name with decreasing coherence, Rachel's familiar tone fragmenting into something that might have been laughter or might have been the sound wind makes through rock formations, might have been acoustic phenomenon or might have been something using my wife's voice like a lure. We didn't stop running until we'd put a mile between us and that cliff face. When I finally allowed myself to look back, the trail behind us was empty. Silent. Just normal Smoky Mountain forest with afternoon sunlight filtering through the canopy and birds calling from the trees. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and called Rachel. She answered on the third ring, voice thick and slow from migraine medication. "Hey babe. How's the hike?" "It's fine." "Good. I wanted to hear your voice." "You okay?" "You sound weird." "I'm fine." Molly found something dead on the trail and it freaked her out. "We're heading back early." We talked for maybe 5 minutes while I walked, her voice in my ear familiar and real and completely different from what I'd heard on that cliff face despite being identical in every technical aspect. There was warmth in Rachel's voice. Personality. The accumulation of 12 years of shared experiences and private jokes and ways we'd learned to communicate that went beyond just words and tone. What I'd heard on the cliff face had been perfect mimicry of sound without any of the humanity underneath. Like something had recorded Rachel saying my name and could replay it with technical accuracy but couldn't replicate the consciousness behind the voice. When I got home, I didn't tell Rachel what actually happened. Didn't tell her something had used her voice to try to lure me up a cliff face while Molly growled at invisible presence on the trail below. Just said we'd had a good hike, that Molly had been weird about some wildlife, that I was glad to be home. But that night, lying in bed with Rachel asleep beside me, I couldn't stop thinking about what would have happened if I'd kept climbing. If I'd reached whatever was calling to me from that cliff face. If I'd walked across that specific section of trail that Molly had been so desperately trying to keep me away from. And I kept thinking about the fact that Molly wasn't staring at the cliff above us. She was staring at the ground below the voice. Like whatever was calling to me wasn't actually up on that rock face at all. Like it was standing on the trail, invisible, waiting for me to position myself directly above it before, what? I didn't know. Didn't want to know. 3 weeks later, a hiker went missing on that same section of the Alum Cave Trail. Experienced solo hiker, no history of mental health issues, last seen by other trail users around mid-morning. Search and rescue found his pack and phone at the base of that same cliff face, like he'd set them down carefully before starting to climb. But they never found him. The official report said he'd likely fallen during an attempted rock scramble and his body had washed downstream during recent rain. But the search teams couldn't explain why an experienced hiker would attempt that particular climb, which led nowhere and offered nothing worth the risk. I didn't tell them what I knew. Didn't explain that something in those mountains can perfectly mimic voices, can use the people you love as bait, can call to you with such accuracy that your body responds before your brain can process the impossibility. Didn't tell them that if I hadn't had Molly with me that day, they'd be writing the same report about my disappearance, inventing explanations for why I'd climbed that cliff face toward a voice that sounded exactly like home. I still hiked the Smokies. But never without Molly. And if I ever hear Rachel's voice calling from somewhere she couldn't possibly be, I'll trust the dog's growl over 12 years of conditioned response to my wife's voice. Because Molly could see what I couldn't. Could sense what was really standing on that trail below the mimic voice. And whatever it was, she knew it wanted me to climb. 2M Kathleen Gaither, and I've been solo camping in the Smokies for about 7 years now. Started doing it after my divorce, needed to prove to myself I could be alone without falling apart, and it turned out I was actually pretty good at it. Better than being married, honestly. I work as a pharmacy tech in Gatlinburg, and most of my coworkers think I'm crazy for spending my weekends alone in the backcountry, but they've never experienced that specific kind of peace you only get when you're miles from the nearest human and the only sounds are wind and water and your own breathing. The tree stand wasn't on any of my maps. I found it around 1,700 hours on the second day of a 3-day loop through the backcountry near Cades Cove, deep enough in that I'd only seen one other hiker all day and they'd been heading in the opposite direction that morning. I'd gone off-trail maybe a quarter mile to find a good campsite with water access, and that's when I saw it through the trees, a platform built maybe 40 feet up in a massive oak, with a ladder made of 2x4s nailed directly into the trunk leading up to it. Hunting stands aren't uncommon in areas adjacent to the park, but this was weird for several reasons. First, we were well inside park boundaries where hunting is prohibited. Second, the construction looked old, weathered gray wood, rusty nails, the kind of deterioration that suggested it had been here for years, maybe decades. And third, it was way higher than any hunting stand needed to be. Deer hunters build platforms maybe 12 to 15 feet up. This thing was 40 feet if it was an inch, high enough that falling would definitely kill you. I should have kept walking. Should have found a different campsite and left the obviously abandoned structure alone. But I was a climber before I was a hiker, did sport climbing through college, and something about that ladder called to me. Maybe I wanted to see the view from up there, or maybe I was just curious about who'd built it and why they'd gone to such effort for something that served no obvious purpose. The ladder was surprisingly solid despite its age. The 2x4s were nailed directly into the oak's trunk, each one tested by my weight before I committed to it, and they held firm even though the wood creaked and the nails had oxidized to rough orange. The climb took maybe 3 minutes, hand over hand, trying not to look down as the ground dropped away beneath me. The platform at the top was about 6 feet by 6 feet, built from weathered plywood with a simple railing that felt disturbingly fragile when I tested it. But the view was incredible, canopy spreading out in every direction, ridgelines visible in the distance, the kind of perspective you normally only get from fire towers or summit peaks. I could see why someone had built this, even if the location and height didn't make practical sense. I made a stupid decision then. Decided to spend the night up there instead of on the ground. The platform was large enough for my sleeping bag, and the railing would keep me from rolling off in my sleep. It felt safer somehow, elevated above anything that might wander through camp, isolated, like sleeping in a treehouse. I hauled my pack up using the rope I always carried, secured it to the platform, and settled in as sunset turned the forest gold and purple. I fell asleep around 2,100 hours, lulled by the gentle sway of the platform in the evening breeze and the distant sound of a creek I'd crossed earlier. Woke up around 0200 to complete darkness and the absolute certainty that something was wrong. The platform was vibrating. Not swaying with wind, vibrating with rhythmic pulses that came from below. Someone was climbing the ladder. I lay completely still, barely breathing, listening to the sound of weight shifting from rung to rung. But here's what made my skin crawl: there was no other sound. No breathing. No grunt of effort. No equipment rattling. No verbal announcement like, "Hey, someone's up there, just coming to check on you." Just the steady vibration of weight moving up the ladder in complete silence. I reached slowly for my headlamp, hands shaking, thinking maybe it was a park ranger checking on the structure, or another hiker who'd seen my light earlier and decided to investigate. But the complete silence felt wrong. People don't climb 40-foot ladders in darkness without making sound. They don't ascend that height without breathing hard from exertion. The vibrations continued. Steady. Patient. Getting closer. I could feel each rung taking weight as whatever was climbing moved methodically upward. Maybe 20 feet below now. Then 15. Then 10. I clicked on my headlamp and looked over the platform's edge. Nothing. Just the ladder descending into darkness, empty rungs disappearing into the shadows below. But the vibrations continued, and now I could see the ladder itself moving slightly with each pulse of weight, could see the way the 2x4s flexed as something heavy moved from rung to rung. Something invisible was climbing toward me. I grabbed my knife from my pack, a fixed blade I carried for cutting rope and processing firewood, and moved to where the ladder met the platform. The vibrations were maybe 5 feet below now, getting stronger, and I realized with horror that the ladder wasn't just nailed to the tree. It was also secured to the platform with thick rope lashings that someone had used to reinforce the connection. The rope was old. Frayed. I started sawing through it with my knife, blade biting into the fibers while the platform vibrated with increasing intensity. The first rope parted. Then the second. The ladder shifted, weight pulling it away from the platform, and that's when I felt it, a change in the vibration pattern. Like whatever was climbing had realized what I was doing and was moving faster now, racing to reach the platform before I could cut the final rope. I sawed frantically at the last lashing, knife blade heating from friction, rope fibers snapping one by one. The vibration was right below me now, maybe 2 feet, close enough that I should have been able to see hands gripping the platform's edge. But there was nothing visible, just that terrible weight and the ladder pulling harder against the remaining rope. The final fibers parted. The ladder fell away from the platform with a sound like a gunshot, taking whatever had been climbing with it. I heard it hit the ground 40 feet below, a massive impact that shook the entire tree and sent birds erupting from nearby branches. Then silence. I stayed on that platform until first light, knife in hand, watching the darkness below for any sign of movement. When dawn finally came, I looked down and saw the ladder sprawled on the forest floor, 2x4s scattered like broken bones. But there was nothing else. No body. No footprints in the soft ground around the base of the tree. No indication that anything had fallen except the ladder itself. I climbed down using the rope I'd hauled my pack up with, rappelling technique from my climbing days, hands shaking so badly I could barely grip. When I reached the ground, I examined the area carefully. The ladder's impact had left clear marks in the dirt and leaf litter. But there were no other disturbances. No trail leading to or from the tree. No evidence that anything had been there except me and my paranoia. I hiked out that morning, cut my trip short by a day, didn't tell anyone what had happened. Because what would I say? That something invisible had climbed a 40-foot ladder in complete silence. That I'd cut the ladder down and heard something massive hit the ground but found no body. But 3 weeks later, another hiker reported finding a tree stand in the same area. Described it as unusually high, probably 40 feet, and mentioned feeling uncomfortable near it. Park Service investigated and confirmed the location. They found my severed rope still attached to the platform. And they found something else. Fresh 2x4s nailed into the tree trunk. A new ladder, already rebuilt, leading up to that same platform 40 feet above the forest floor. Like something needed that ladder. Needed that access. Needed to be able to climb up to where people might decide to spend the night feeling safe and elevated above the dangers on the ground. I don't camp off trail anymore. And I definitely don't climb mysterious structures built in places they shouldn't exist. Because something in those mountains can climb in complete silence. Can fall 40 feet and leave no body. Can rebuild what I destroyed, waiting patiently for the next person who thinks elevation means safety. Waiting to climb toward them in the darkness while they sleep. I am Marcus Chen, and I teach high school biology in Knoxville. I've been planning a solo 5-day backpacking trip through the backcountry near the Appalachian Trail corridor since the end of the school year, needed that annual reset where I could think about anything other than lesson plans and parent-teacher conferences. 4th time doing an extended solo trip in the Smokies, always the same general area because I knew the terrain and felt comfortable being that isolated for that long. I found the cold spot on my first morning. I'd made camp the previous evening along a creek maybe 6 miles from the nearest trailhead, set up my tent in a small clearing with good water access and decent tree coverage. Woke up around 0630 to frost on my tent despite the weather forecast predicting overnight lows in the mid-50s. When I unzipped the vestibule to check the temperature, I saw it immediately, a perfectly circular patch of ground maybe 8 feet in diameter, about 30 yards from my tent, where the grass and leaves were covered in thick frost that looked more like winter than late September. I walked over to investigate, curious about what would cause such localized temperature variation. The moment I stepped into the circle, the cold hit me like I'd walked into a walk-in freezer. Had to be 20 degrees colder inside that boundary than the surrounding air. My breath immediately visible, skin prickling with goosebumps despite wearing a fleece and soft shell. But the edge was sharp, perfectly defined. One step inside the circle and I was freezing. One step out and the temperature returned to normal cool morning air. I'm a science teacher. I understand microclimates and cold air drainage and thermal inversions that can create localized temperature pockets. But this was too perfect. Too circular. Too cold for any natural phenomenon I could identify. I took photos, checked my thermometer, it read 32 degrees inside the circle, 54 degrees 5 feet outside it. A 22-degree difference across a boundary you could draw with a compass. I spent most of that day hiking, putting the weird cold spot out of my mind, telling myself it was just some geothermal anomaly or underground water flow creating unusual surface conditions. Got back to camp around 1,700 hours, started setting up for dinner, and noticed the frost circle was gone. Just normal ground, same temperature as everything else. Okay. So it was a morning phenomenon related to overnight cooling patterns. That made sense, kind of. Woke up the second morning around 0630 again, unzipped my tent, and saw the frost circle immediately. Same size. Same perfect circular shape. Same impossible temperature differential when I walked into it. But it had moved. It was now maybe 20 feet closer to my tent than it had been the previous morning. Not in a different location randomly, closer. Like it had migrated during the night in a specific direction. Toward where I was sleeping. I told myself I was imagining it. That I'd misjudged the distance the first morning, or that there were multiple cold spots and I'd simply noticed a different one. Marked the location with a stick poked into the ground at the circle's center, then hiked out for the day trying not to think about it. Third morning. The cold spot was 20 feet closer again. I could confirm it this time because I'd marked yesterday's location, and the new circle was definitely nearer to my tent. Close enough now that if I stood at my tent door and threw a rock, it would land inside the frost boundary. That's when the rational explanations stopped working. Geothermal features don't move. Cold air drainage patterns don't migrate systematically in one direction over multiple nights. And they definitely don't orient themselves toward human presence like they're tracking something. I should have packed up and hiked out right then. But I had 3 more days planned, and the cold spot hadn't actually done anything threatening beyond existing and moving. So I stayed. Told myself I was being paranoid. That I'd document the phenomenon and report it to park scientists who could study whatever unusual thermal pattern was occurring here. Fourth morning. The circle was now 10 feet from my tent. Close enough that I could see the frost patterns from my sleeping bag when I unzipped the vestibule. Close enough that the temperature inside my tent felt noticeably colder than previous nights, like the circle was starting to affect the surrounding air even outside its sharp boundary. I spent that entire day hiking in circles, unable to focus, debating whether to leave or stay. Part of me wanted to see what would happen if the circle reached my tent. Would it pass underneath? Would it stop? Would something emerge from that impossible cold? But a stronger part, the part that had kept me alive through 7 years of solo backcountry travel, said that finding out was not worth the risk. Fifth morning. I woke up at 0430, earlier than planned, woken by cold that had crept into my sleeping bag despite my 15-degree rating. Unzipped the vestibule and saw the frost circle touching my tent. The perfect boundary now intersected my shelter's footprint, one edge of the 8-foot diameter running directly under where I'd been sleeping. The cold was intense now. Painful. My fingers numb despite being inside my bag. Breath visible in thick clouds. And when I looked at the ground inside the circle, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. Footprints. Just one set. Barefoot. Human-sized. Walking in a slow spiral pattern from the circle's edge toward its center, where they stopped at a point that would be directly under my tent if the circle advanced another 10 feet. I was packed and hiking out within 20 minutes. Didn't stop to make coffee. Didn't bother with breakfast. Just collapsed my tent, stuffed everything in my pack, and started moving toward the trailhead while the sky was still dark. Behind me, I swear I felt the temperature drop. Like the cold spot was advancing faster now that I was leaving. Racing to catch me before I made it out of range. I hiked the 6 miles to the trailhead in under 2 hours, practically running the last mile, and didn't look back until I was in my car with the engine running and heat blasting. 3 weeks later, a solo camper reported unusual frost patterns in that same area. Park Service investigated and found a circular patch of ground with frost coverage despite warm overnight temperatures. They attributed it to a previously undocumented cold air sink and closed that section of backcountry, pending environmental assessment. But I talked to one of the rangers off the record. Asked what they'd really found. He said there were multiple frost circles. Dozens of them. All perfectly circular. All moving in systematic patterns like they were searching for something. Like they were tracking the thermal signatures of warm-blooded animals moving through their territory. He told me they'd found the footprints too. Barefoot spirals leading to the center of each circle. Always stopping at a point that suggested something standing there, waiting, measuring the distance to nearby tents or sleeping bags. Measuring how many more nights it would take to reach the warmth inside. I'm Dirk Rhodes, and this happened on my way out of the park after that 5-day trip I mentioned earlier. I'd convinced my buddy Tyler to pick me up from the trailhead instead of leaving my car there for the whole week. He owed me a favor and I'd promised him dinner in Gatlinburg as payment for the 2-hour round trip from Knoxville. We left the trailhead around 19:30 hours, later than planned because I'd taken my time breaking camp that final morning. The sun had already dropped behind the ridgeline, and we were driving through that specific kind of mountain darkness where your headlights feel inadequate and the forest presses close on both sides of the narrow park road. Tyler was telling some story about his new girlfriend when I saw it on the ridge to our right. A silhouette standing against the last purple light of sunset, maybe 200 yards away on the ridgeline. Tall, unusually tall, and completely motionless in a way that human bodies just aren't when they're standing on uneven terrain. "Pull over," I said. Tyler stopped talking mid-sentence. "What?" "Just pull over. Look at the ridge." He pulled onto the narrow shoulder and killed the engine. We both stared up at the figure. It was darker now, harder to see against the sky, but the silhouette was unmistakable. Too tall. Too still. Wrong proportions that suggested limbs that were too long or joints that bent in places they shouldn't. "Is that a person?" Tyler asked. Before I could answer, the figure moved. Raised both arms slowly, deliberately, in this exaggerated wave that looked like someone mocking the gesture rather than performing it naturally. Arms going too high, held too long, moving with mechanical precision that had nothing to do with human greeting behavior. "Drive," I said. "What?" "Drive. Right now." Tyler started the engine and accelerated, gravel spitting from the tires. I kept watching through the side mirror as the ridge disappeared behind us, but the figure didn't move again. Just stood there with arms raised like a frozen statue. We didn't talk for the next 5 miles. Tyler drove faster than he should have on those winding mountain roads, and I didn't tell him to slow down. When we finally hit the main highway and street lights appeared, the tension broke and Tyler started making nervous jokes about bears standing on their hind legs and how I'd gotten paranoid from too many nights alone in the woods. I agreed with him. Said I'd probably just been freaked out by a weirdly shaped tree or a rock formation that looked human-shaped in the fading light. We got dinner in Gatlinburg like I'd promised, and I almost convinced myself that's all it had been. Then I checked my dashcam footage the next morning. I'd installed it after a near miss with a deer the previous year, one of those cheap models that records continuously while the car's running. The footage showed exactly what we'd seen, the dark figure on the ridge, the unnatural wave, us driving away. But it also showed something else. 7 miles down the road, our headlights swept across a tall silhouette standing in the middle of the pavement. Same proportions. Same wrong height. There for just one frame before we drove through the space where it had been standing. Tyler and I had been talking at that exact moment. Neither of us had seen it. We'd driven directly through where it was standing without hitting anything, without swerving, without any indication that something had been there. I've replaced that dashcam 3 times now. Keep buying new ones, thinking maybe the old one was defective. But the same thing keeps happening. I'll park my car at night, and in the morning the footage shows that same tall silhouette standing beside my driver's side door. Never moving. Just standing there in the darkness. Watching. I don't know if it was saying hello or goodbye that night on the ridge. But I think it followed me home. Let me know your opinion about the story in the comments below. And make sure you're subscribed.